Welcome to So and So, brought to you by Bernina, Made to Create. I'm Meg Goodman, and you're about to enjoy a casual conversation with a special member of the sewist and quilting community. A conversation about how they got started, what inspires them, what excites them, and their connection to this community. Our guest today is Phyllis Elmore, a remarkable woman whose story is as unforgettable as the quilts that helped shape her life. Phyllis is the author of Quilt of Souls, a memoir, a powerful and deeply personal memoir that has touched readers across the country. Born in Detroit and raised by her grandmother Lula in rural Alabama, Phyllis found herself immersed in a world of deep wisdom, quiet strength, and generational resilience. It was there, surrounded by women who stitched their pain, perseverance, and history into quilts, that Phyllis discovered healing and the true meaning of family. In 1973, Phyllis joined the United States Air Force and was one of the first female Aircraft Pneudraulic Specialists for the B-52 bomber. After leaving the Air Force, she attended the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, graduating with a Bachelor of Science Degree in Sociology. In 2001, she joined the Army National Guard as an active duty Guard member. It's also noteworthy to mention that Phyllis was one of only a handful of women in the military who served 3 major military conflicts, including the Vietnam era, where she served a temporary duty assignment to Vietnam before the 1975 fall of Saigon. She was also deployed to Saudi Arabia as a member of Operation Desert Storm, and in December 2003 as a member of the Army National Guard, where she was deployed in support of Operation Enduring Freedom. In her civilian career, she worked as a counselor for incarcerated youth and for women who were victims of domestic violence. She also spent 10 years as a substance abuse counseling supervisor. In her remarkable book, Quilt of Souls, Phyllis shares stories that were nearly lost. Stories of the Black women who raised children not theirs, who had held families together through hardship, and who passed down their heritage through hands that stitched, cooked, comforted, and carried so much. Her writing is rich, lyrical, and full of love, an act of remembrance, and a celebration of the strength it takes to keep going and to keep telling the truth. Phyllis Elmore, welcome to So and So.
Thank you, Meg. I am so honored to be here and to be a guest on your show. I don't know how I got so lucky.
Well, we feel we're the lucky ones because you have got such an amazing story to share with us about your personal journey and the book that you wrote. And I'm going to jump right in and talk about your childhood. You were born in Detroit, but you soon moved in with your grandmother in Alabama. Tell us about your memories of this time.
Well, I remember I grew up in Detroit at least my first 4 years before I was sent to Alabama. I had no idea I was going. Of course, I was only 4, and I have vague memories of being outside playing with my brothers, and then this black car pulls up, and as a child, the car was huge. It could have been a Volkswagen type, but for a but for a 4 year old, it was humongous. And I remember being loaded into this car. My sister had just finished putting a ribbon in my hair, and I remember those yellow ribbons, and they were because they wasn't tied. Somehow
Hmm.
they came loose. And I remember getting in the car and all these big people, all adults, and I was in the back seat with these 2 older guys, and I was just, when you're a kid like that, you don't travel very much in the car. Very few people in Detroit had cars. Black
Hmm.
people had cars, so I was just happy of being in a car and going somewhere. I didn't ask where I was going because back then children just, you're not supposed to ask adults questions. That was the way I was raised. That was the norm for that day. But then as the hours started getting later and I started seeing the changes in the scenery, um, I started crying. And I remember getting on my knees looking out the back window as the it turned from concrete to dirt roads. And before I knew it, I was in my grandparents' front yard, deep, deep. deep Alabama, I call it. We didn't. I think it barely had a name of that little township, but it was very rural. All I saw was cows and horses and all types of wildlife. But that was scary for a 4-year-old. It was very scary, and I just remember crying so much and so often and shaken. And I wasn't shaken out of being cold because of the elements. I was shaken because I was actually afraid. I was scared. I didn't
Hmm.
know where I was, but I just remember my grandmother being so warm and so loving. My grandfather was gruff, but that's typical for old men. I'm not going to even attach a color to it, but old men in the South, they just wasn't the warm, lovey-dovey type. But my grandmother embraced me. But this went on for about 3 months or 3 weeks, I should say, just being afraid and scared and shaking every night because both me and my grandparents, we were in the same bedroom. We shared the same bedroom, only a little small aisle separating us. And I was in this huge bed by myself, and we had no electricity, mind you. The once the light the fire in the fireplace went out at night, that meant that it was right around midnight.
Hmm.
So I was shaking even with the fireplace. And I guess my grandmother would look over at me and just say, I have to do something to this child. She's scared and she cries every night. So I remember her getting up and going into one of the little back rooms. And she came back with this quilt. And I could still see flickers from the fireplace. It was still a little light, and she brought this musty smelling half made quilt, and she wrapped me up in it just like a baby being swaddled. And she told me, I remember her saying, I can't remember word for word, but I remember her saying, this quilt is now yours, and it's going to get bigger, and it's going to get better, and you're going to have it with you for the rest of your life. And that was it for that. And from then on, we would sit outside, and she would put pieces of she would use different pieces and place in my quilt. And I won't give it away, but it took a long time for her to complete this quilt, make it a full quilt. And I
Hmm.
think probably meant to be that way because she was telling a story, and the story could not be quick. It could not be erratic. It just had to be done in her time.
Hmm.
And the story just blossomed into something I could never imagine. And that's what's laid out in the book, how this story of this quilt, of my Quilt of Souls, evolved over those 9 years that I spent with my grandparents.
So, Grandmother Lula as you mentioned, had a very deep influence on you. Can you introduce us to her a little bit more and tell us about how she touched her life then and how it has shaped who you are today?
My grandmother, the first story I heard in her upbringing is she was born in a little town called Sandersville, Mississippi, which is a part of Jones County. And I don't know whether you watched the movie. It was a movie with, I can't remember the guy, but it was based in Jones County.
Hmm.
But that's the part of Mississippi that she was from. And she talked about her parents. Her mother was born around, I would say, put it around 1840, and
Hmm.
both her parents. And her mother, according to my grandmother, her mother had 3 children who were sold into slavery. And all I know about that is that my grandmother said they were still sucking. So that mean they were infants pretty much.
Hmm.
And she said my her mother was so hurt by her children being snatched from her that her mother thought that she was barren and she could never have any more kids. But around 1870 or so, my grandmother's oldest sister Ella came into being, was born. And then my grandmother came a few years after her in 1883. My grandmother was born, and her mother was a quilter. That's about the only information that she could share on her mother, was that about her children that was sold away. But I'm assuming that she learned quilting from her mother because she's talked about how her and her sister Ella would make, and along with the mother, would make quilts for um, the ex-slave owners they stayed on on their property once slavery ended. They decided to stay, and according to my grandmother, was they decided to stay because in her mother's mind, she thought that one day these three babies would return. That was the thought process.
Mm-hmm.
So my grandmother, she was influential for me because she was a quilter and her quilts told stories. And she had some amazing stories to tell. And I am assuming that she adopted that Quilt of Souls philosophy
Hmm.
of making quilts from her mother, who never made quilts. My grandmother never made quilts from the clothing of people unless they had passed on.
Mm-hmm.
She never used new material or new cloth in her Quilt of Souls. I would watch when people would drop off sacks of clothing of people who had passed on. And my grandmother would stand in that front yard and she would pray with these people. And the people would leave, and we would sit in the front yard and we would sew on those quilts. And my grandmother would tell me stories about the people whose clothing were in the quilts. Now, I don't know whether or not she learned what she had a personal connection with these people, or at least it appeared to me that she had a personal connection with that family member who delivered the clothing to her. So she would tell me as much as she knew about that person who both delivered the quilt and the clothing that was going into the quilt. And she would sit there and she would sing and she would tell the story. And then once she completed that quilt, the person would come and pick up the quilt and she would pray again and she would tell them, this quilt will be an important part of your life. I'm paraphrasing what she would say. And she would pray, and the person would just, I would watch the people get so emotional when they picked up the quilt from my grandmother. It was almost like some type of ceremonial type
Hmm.
situation event.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the first thing I learned about grandmother in my quilt. And as I got older, the stories became more profound. As a kid, sometimes a story would stick with you, and then sometimes, you want to be running out building mud pies or something. But my grandmother's stories stuck with me, and
Mm-hmm.
sometimes she would work on quilts and other people would come over, and I wasn't allowed to sit in and listen to adult conversations. So I would go under the house and sneak and listen. And those were some of the most amazing stories. But what I found out over the years, my grandmother was an amazing storyteller, full of wisdom, full of honor, and she was just a different type of person. Her depth of forgiveness, like one of the stories I wrote, and which is, I had a difficult time writing, and my editor knew I had a difficult time writing because that story reflects so much about my grandmother and who she was. And it was either chapter 7 or chapter 8. It was called Twixt Laurel and Livingston. The
Hmm.
depth of her forgiveness and how she forgave people. And I would just over the years, I would get so angry at her forgiving people, her forgiveness of people. And that after she finished telling me that story, I said to myself, how could I ever forgive this person for treating my grandmother so badly? But my grandmother forgave. And just as much as she forgave, she was so giving. On the other end of the spectrum, she was very giving too, because we would sit and we would make jars and jars of jelly and preserves. And what she would do, she would give it all away. And we would probably have 2 or 3 jars of jelly and preserve left. And I used to get so angry because I love my grandmother's canning. We would My grandmother would climb up in the pecan tree and shake the tree, and I would have to pick up all these pecans and put them in the tin buckets. And what happens? She would give most of it away. And so those were two things I just could not understand, her forgiving and her giving nature. And that's what I grew up with. And then I come to find out years later, I'm just like my grandmother. You always say, I'm not going to be that way. I'll never do that. But she had such a profound impact on my life from the time I left Alabama all the way up until this point in my life. My grandmother, I'm a direct reflection of her, and I always quote her quite a bit when I'm talking to people. So yeah, the impact she made on my life was amazing. And it's something that I would never forget. And I always say there's one Lula Horne, and I don't think there would be another one. She died at the age of 105,
Oh my.
and she could still thread a needle. She has a newspaper article and that the Birmingham News did on her, and she was 100 years old. She was celebrating her hundredth year birthday, and the newspaper person interviewed her, and they watched her. They said even at 100, she could still thread a needle on the first with the first, because I have to maybe take 3 or 4 attempts to do it,
Hmm.
but she, I guess maybe just, when you do it, it becomes rote. And then, but even with her eyes, she was still able to do that. So my grandmother was a very, very special person in my life.
It undoubtedly. We will look forward to meeting her spirit in your book.
Yes.
Um, and speaking of spirit and service, in the spirit of that and what your grandmother taught you, you chose to serve in the Air Force and later in the Army. Why did you make that decision? And tell us about your military career.
Well, when I went back to Detroit, I was a troubled teen because I was kind of snatched away from my grandmother. And it was almost like in reverse, or I should say, around on the same level of being taken away from my sisters and brothers and parents and being sent to Alabama. So I had to acclimate myself to Alabama. And then at the age of 13, I was snatched from Alabama and brought back to Detroit. And that was a pretty rough transition because I didn't know my sisters and brothers. And I didn't know my parents either. And they also didn't know me. So I had to get used to that fact. So I had trouble adapting to that environment. So I started running away from home when I was 14, 15. And the last time I ran away, I was placed in a girls' home. They said, okay, well, you run away from home, then, we're just going to have to place you somewhere where, to try to get you some help to try to settle your mind, so to speak. I was considered a incorrigible young girl, but I just wanted to get away. I was searching, because I was a young girl. I was a troubled, very troubled young girl. Was dealing with some abuse, and so I just left home at an early age, and I never lived at home after the age of 15. And I ended
Hmm.
up being placed in Job Corps, and there I learned skills, and I looked at myself and what I really wanted to do when I turned 18. And so I would see these commercials, and I said, I'm going to join the Air Force. So when I finished up Job Corps, was sent back to Detroit, um, I went to the recruiter, and this was 1973. This was at the height of that transition, that military transition,
Hmm.
where the president gave an order that women, that they need to open up the career fields for both the Air Force and the Army to women, those non-traditional fields. So of course I was one of the first people that was first one of the first women who was going to enter into that non-traditional field. So I went to the recruiter. He said, oh my goodness, you're here just in time. Boy, did we had a job for you. I said, and at that time I was searching. I wanted somewhere, that I can plant my feet. And so he said, well, we're going to make you an aircraft hydraulic technician. And I said, well, what is that? And he said, well, you scored high enough, which I found out I didn't. I think I only, the ASVAB is broken down into electronics and mechanics and administration and another. And I think I only scored maybe like a 15 or 20, which is very low on the electronics. But the recruiter had to make his quota. So whatever they had to do to steer women or young girls into these non-traditional career fields, that's what they did. So the score, I'm pretty sure, was lowered for that fact. So I went into the Air Force as a mechanic, and I hated messing with tools and wrenches and nuts and bolts and all that sort of thing. So I got the basic training, and I went to tech school. And back then there was no stereotypes, was wicked. Oh my goodness, there was no such thing. And I remember the instructor telling me, if you come up here and give me a kiss, I will pass you to the next one.
Oh
And
my.
and I said, I said to myself, so I went up there and gave him a quick peck on the jaw. And I looked at him and I said, what did I do wrong? And he passed me. And and because the recruiter had told me, he said, well, you don't have to worry about passing to the next course because the guys are going to help you. They're going to do everything they can to get you through it. So I said to myself, I had to reach back into my grandma's bag of tricks. And I said, I am going to do this and I'm going to do this on my own. So what I did, I learned it. I learned all the electronic work. I learned all the things that I needed to do to pass on hydraulic and hydraulic fluid into the B-52 wings and rudders and all that sort of thing. I learned this on my own. I refused to ask help. And I learned it so well that they had me helping other guys do it. So I did not want to be a mechanic, but I was dedicated and I said, I'm going to get through this. And as soon as I can, I am going to go into another field. So once I finished, they sent me off to Beale Air Force Base in California and the home of the SR-21. But my unit was headed over to Thailand to bring back the B-52s.
Hmm.
And so went TDY with them for a couple of weeks. And when I got there, the guys would disappear because I was the only woman. And I wouldn't see them the entire weekend. They would come back on Monday morning. We would clean up the planes and bring them on back to the States. And so that was my life. And so I was young and I had never experienced anything like that. And so I stayed in that field until I was able to transfer over to another aviation unit in another aviation field. And I got out of the military after 5 years. I started my college education at University of Maryland, and I did that. And I worked with teenagers, juvenile delinquents. And I said, well, I think I want to go into the air guard, and that's what I did. But unfortunately, when I did that, it corresponded with the same time of Operation Desert Storm and
Mhm.
Operation Desert Shield. So I got caught up in that. So once I finished that, I said, that's it. I'm not no more military for me. So I worked on the civilian side, and in 2000, old Army buddy came to me and said that, well, if you go into the Army National Guard, they're giving out bonuses for prior service people. He said, we can split this $2,500. I said, I didn't want to do it because I kind of felt, oh. So I went into the Army National Guard. We split the bonus. And shortly after, I got deployed in support of Operation Enduring Freedom.
Mm.
So I was on my third deployment. So I said, well, I'm just going to stay in the extra 9, 10 years and just going to retire because I couldn't see giving away all that good service and not get a retirement after that. And so that's
Hmm.
exactly what I did. And that's how I ended up in those three campaigns and in two different military branches.
Phyllis, that's quite a story. It
Yes,
really
it
is.
is. I've had quite a life, Meg.
In,
Let me tell
indeed, you have. Phyllis, you used a term that I'm not familiar with. You said you went TDY.
Yes. Oh, that's temporary duty where you're not stationed permanently. You just need to go over there, complete a job, complete an assignment, and come back.
Well, we
No
just learned
temporary
something new. Thank you.
duty. Yeah, yes.
Now you mentioned some of the work you did. You served as a counselor for youth and incarcerated women who were victims of domestic violence.
Right.
Talk about what's important that we know about the people that you served.
Well, I started out working with adolescents, and there was a reason for that because I think adolescents have a different story to tell, and I was really intrigued by their stories because our stories were similar. These were kids who had a rough home life, and they went out and they got in trouble, and I was always drawn to these type of kids. And just to add a little writing piece into that, what helped me through my adolescent years is writing poetry because poetry was very healing for me. And my philosophy is that writing your story, and I developed this little quote. It's RIGHT, and I draw a line through, strike through of WRITE. So you have to write your story. And writing was so therapeutic, and that was my goal to teach kids. And as I went on, evolved into working with women and men in substance abuse, I would always encourage them to sit down and just write your story, write the person who offended you, the person who abused you, write how you really feel, because especially women who had sexual abuse and physical abuse, and that person is no longer here. It's so therapeutic when you write that letter to these people, telling them how you really felt, because you couldn't do it in your lifetime or their lifetime, but now you have an opportunity to write to these people and tell them exactly how you felt. Express your feelings. And I'm a firm believer is that's why a lot of times people will go out and they will take that anger turned inward, and get involved in drugs and crime, and because all that anger and hostility is all bottled up there. My
Mm-hmm.
grandmother taught me that, and that's why I ended up telling stories, because storytelling helped me, because all the time that I lived in bus stations and libraries, and I stayed out of trouble. I would hide out, actually skip school and go to libraries and write. And writing was so therapeutic. And so that was my goal, to teach people to channel that anger, and channel the anger through writing.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the reason I wanted to always get into the helping field, because my grandmother was a helper. If my grandmother was living in this lifetime, I know she would be a social worker or counselor
Mm-hmm.
or a nurse, or she would be helping people. And that's my upbringing, and that's my passion. So that's why I wanted to get into that field.
So you talk about writing. You are a writer and author. Your book, Quilt of Souls.
Right.
What inspired you to finally write this book?
I was when I was deployed. I always procrastinated about writing, because I had so many stories in my head, and I didn't want to live. I didn't want to leave these stories there, because they're stories that are meant to be told. And I've really felt that telling these stories would in turn help other people, whatever that, whatever they were going through. Somehow they can latch onto one of those stories. This was my this is what I was thinking out loud,
Mm-hmm.
but come to find out, it actually happened, because I have received so many letters and so many emails telling me how that story resonated with them in their life, their grandmother. Because I've always felt that grandmothers were the most underrated demographics that ever existed.
Mm-hmm.
Grandmothers just don't get their just due. you know
Indeed.
yeah, especially now, and especially in that era, because what we don't talk about, and which I would love to do research on, is how my parents were part of the Great Migration, when droves of black folks left the South and went north, looking for better opportunities, job opportunities, social opportunities, you know financial, economic opportunities. But nobody ever talked about the kids that were sent back south, because when they got there and started having children, they had a difficult time raising those children and financing those children, and just because it was too much. So I mean, I went my little 40 some room 2-room school, Bethel Hill Elementary School. I guarantee you that 3/4 of my classmates, or the kids that were in that school, were being raised by their grandparents or their grandmothers. And we don't talk about that much. The grandmothers were the caretakers. I mean, they were the main caretakers of that. A lot of those kids who got caught up in the Great Migration,
Mm-hmm.
because they were being raised by their grandparents. And we there is a story that each one of these kids carry. I would love to just do more research on getting those stories. How did these kids make out?
Mm-hmm.
Just like myself, I know it was a struggle for me initially, but the grandparents were the backbone, and we
Mm-hmm.
loved our and a lot of times, and I kid you not, a lot of these kids didn't even know that this were their grandparents. They thought they were their parents.
Mm-hmm.
So they were told, no, that was your grandmother. And they're shocked, like, oh my goodness, I knew so many of those kids. So the grandmother was the grandparents were very, very, very important in these kids' lives.
Do you have a special story when you were doing your research of something that was very meaningful to you?
I would think there's so many. I would say one of the most prolific um, things that I encountered is going back, grabbing those sayings from my grandmother, and how those same sayings kind of like blossom. As a kid, you're looking through it through a child's vision, but as you become adult, you see exactly what your grandmother was saying when she said it. For instance, she took me to an old slave cemetery that sat real close to our house. And she told me, she said, Child, she said, you see these folks laying here? These are the best stories you ain't never heard. And
Mm.
that stayed with me. And that was one of my major research things that I wanted to really, really delve into, is those people's stories. So in researching these people's stories, I went back, for instance, the slave narratives. That's what was so interesting as I was researching my Quilt of Souls stories, because my great great grandfather was one of the most interviewed members of the slave in those oral histories.
Mhm.
And just going back, researching his stories, and reading the stories that was captured by the author who wrote the stories of the Alabama or the Sumter County slave narratives. Then I went back and tied those same stories that my great grandfather told to Ruby Pickens Tart, the author, and it was the same stories that my grandmother's husband, told me about his father. And my grandmother knew the stories too. So just digging into that research, and because when my grandmother told me about the best stories you ain't never heard, I knew there had to be a tie-in somewhere, something that I had to pursue further, something that was going on there that I needed to research. And the secondly, I think I may have to put this just a little bit higher than that, researching my grandmother's family, because she really didn't have it. The only family known family members that she had were her children and grandchildren, because her oldest sister Ella passed away, and then the three siblings that were sold in slavery, and then both her parents passed away. So her ancestry or her lineage was broken, and I wanted to connect that lineage again. So I had to do my mother's DNA and my DNA and my father's DNA to determine my grandmother's lineage, or at least try to connect with them. So
Mhm.
slowly but surely, I'm putting her pieces together. It's a process, but that was one of the things that was most, I guess, intriguing about doing the research for Quilt of Souls, is
Mhm.
how all those other pieces connected to Quilt of Souls, and some pieces I probably will never know.
It sounds to me like there's a second book in the works.
Yeah,
You're not done telling your stories yet.
no, no, there is so many. There are so many stories, and I love telling my grandmother's story.
Phyllis, you've talked about quilts, and the stories around those, and the quilts that your grandmother made from those who had passed. In doing the research for the book, was there any particular quilt that holds a special story or meaning for you?
Oh my goodness, you just had to throw that one out, didn't you?
It's like choosing your favorite child, right?
I know. Yes, Yeah. My Quilt of Souls have it, the clothing that's in that quilt are some of the special people, well, two of the special people that I met while growing up amongst the elders, my grandmother's peers. And one of those was Miss Jubilee. And Miss Jubilee, found out that she was born into slavery. And people always speculated about her age, but she was well over 100, well over 100. And I would have to spend, well, my grandfather, he hated spending time with Miss Jubilee. And she lived maybe about 3 or 4 miles from my grandparents' farm. So my grandfather would just drop me off at her house, and I would have to sit with her and bring her some of my grandmother's preserves and homemade biscuits. And Miss Jubilee loved to talk, and she was very scary looking because she was so old. She had a beard, and she had whiskers, and she had these cat-like hair protruding from her jaws. She was and that's why my classmates would tease me because they would tell me that she was a ghost. So do you know you were spending your time with a ghost? But it got to the point where I was no longer afraid of her, and she told me the stories about her family. But I would sit on her porch or in her room and talk to her, and and it's a story in the book, and I'll give pieces of it away. I burnt my hands in hot water, and my grandmother sent me to Miss Jubilee because I had these gigantic blisters on my hand, and she said, when Edgar go into town, that's my grandfather, he's going to take you with him, and he's going to drop you off at Miss Jubilee, and she is going to make those blisters all better, and your hands is not going to not going to burn anymore. Because my grandmother had to burn. She had put a poultice made of sulfur and homemade molasses,
Mm-hmm.
and it was sticky, and it was, but it's the burning had stopped. But when she take the bandage off, it's all, we have it all over again. So she took me to Miss Jubilee's house, and Miss Jubilee healed my blisters. My blisters dried up a few days later. They had stopped hurting, and she, and I cried, and my Miss Jubilee just held on to me. But she told such scary stories. I mean, but I was very close to Miss Jubilee because just her stories alone were so impactful and intriguing, and those stories I remember for the rest of my life. But her clothing, when I found out Miss Jubilee had passed, and her her granddaughter or daughter brought the clothing to my grandmother, and I didn't know Miss Jubilee had passed,
Mm-hmm.
and until my grandmother told me, and it's almost like my body just left and went somewhere completely different. And I cried so much, and I did not want my grandmother to cut anything from Miss Jubilee's old dresses. I mean, she only had a couple, one or the other. I wanted to do that myself, so I asked grandma to let me cut Miss Jubilee's dresses, and I was so hurt while I was cutting the fabric, and my grandmother saw me, and she saw how I was suffering through that. And so that Miss Jubilee's clothing that's in my quilt, that's in my closet in a pillowcase, is one of the most special pieces of fabric that exists in that quilt, along with my grandmother's sister Ella, because that was a story in itself as well. So, um, but that story sticks out. Miss Jubilee's fabric sticks out more than any other piece of fabric.
And you
And
still have that quilt.
yes, I do. It's very old, and it's rustic. It just maintains its appearance, and it's to be as old as it is so well put together. Because I think when my grandmother made her quilts, number one, I had to go out in the cotton field and pick the cotton that went into her quilts. If people wanted a double thick quilt, I would have to pick, oh my God, I had to pick so much cotton. That's why when me and my husband, we're traveling on the road going south, I see a cotton field and I just want to just stop and just burn it down. But we would, I mean, the cotton that's in my grandmother's quilts is actually cotton that I picked, and and then the batten is, I mean, the back part in the back is feed sack, because my
Hmm.
grandmother used to make dresses in my school clothes out of feed sack. You know,
Hmm.
sometimes flour feed sack. Sometimes I'm going to school and I look like I've been doused in flour because some still. So, but feed sack was a way of the world back then. I mean, if you didn't have at least a dress or two in feed sack, well, you don't belong in Livingston, because all the kids had something, at least one item made from feed sack.
So you've written this book. The stories are just remarkable, and there are so many to be shared.
Yes.
You also have done the Quilt of Souls historical preservation project. Would you tell us about that?
I established the Quilt of Souls Historical Preservation Project. It's a Florida nonprofit. And the idea was derived from my feelings and personal thoughts regarding historical artifacts. You know, these are items that was handed down through the generations. And I felt that value needed to be placed on these items because I think they all have a story to tell, whether it's a set of dishes, one dish, quilts, brooches, whatever. These items has a story behind them. I truly believe that, and I can't say it enough. Because I have talked to so many people who, sometimes you don't know what you know until you actually talk it out. And I had went to this lady's house, and she had a set of dishes, and she kept saying, she said, I only have the saucers and a couple other plates. And she said, those just old dishes. I bring them out, whenever, because my mother passed them down to me, and some of them broke, and the more she talked, the more she started telling these story about these dishes, how her father had went off to the Korean War. I think it was the Korean War, and told her that his mother had gave him the dishes, and his grandmother had gave his mother the dishes.
Mm,
And he talked about the story behind that, how when um when they got married, that when his mother and his father got married, the dishes were brought from somewhere where the person was a slave, and who was an indentured servant from Portugal, and she brought the dish with her. And it's like, so the story just goes on and on and on, and that story has another story behind it, how that all evolved. And so I'm looking at her like, oh my goodness. And that's what got me to thinking. I thought about my grandmother's quilts and how they all have stories. I have my grandmother's last quilt that she made, and she was 100, and she made this quilt. And this quilt has stories because I remember her talking about as she was sewing this quilt. And I wish I had paid more attention. And that's what I'm trying to get people to understand. You get those stories now, because once those people pass away, that story is buried along with them.
mm.
It's no longer a story. It's only a memory of a story. So that's why I tell people, I just encourage people to talk to their elderly relatives, to find out about a certain object, to find out how did that piece evolve? What's the story behind it? And that's why I came up with the Quilt of Stone Historical Preservation Project, which is a pretty new organization, but I'm building on it, and I'm having the first Quilt of Soul event next year in June, where the first part is going to be a 2-day affair in Melbourne, Florida. The first day is going to be a celebration of old quilts, where people will bring in their old quilts that tell a story, and they will hang, and they will put 3x5 cards describing where this quilt came from, you know, how who passed it down to them, and they're gonna get a chance to go up and talk about it for do a 3 to 5 minute presentation on this historical quilt. And so that's going to be my first project, and I'm one that I'm really looking forward to doing. And then the second day, I have workshops that's going to be given, some amazing workshops from these amazing quilters from New York City who have been in the New York Times Magazine. They have been over in Russia doing quilt shows, and each one of them will do a workshop on some amazing thing. I have a woman who is doing a workshop on embroidered cards, weighted quilts for kids who are, with Down syndrome,
Hmm.
you know, that, because weighted quilts are very, very popular now. She's going to teach people how to do weighted quilts. So I have a lot of great workshops planned for the second day of this event. And that's going to be, again, that will be my first Quilt of Souls historical project. And I'm expecting a really large crowd.
And you said that's next year.
Yes, that's next year, June 12th and 13th, 2026, at the Civic Center.
We'll look forward to that.
Yes,
In Melbourne, Florida.
yes.
Phyllis, what do you hope your readers, especially the younger generations, take away from Quilt of Souls?
For the younger generation, I would say, which I'm a prime proponent of writing your story. If you have problems in school, if you have problems bullying, if you have problems just finding yourself and trying to understand yourself, or you have problems at home, um, write them, write them down. Talk about how you feel, because it's something about when we write that down, write all that information down on paper. It's almost like regurgitating, you know, and you feel so much better once you do. And then you decide what you want to do with that. You know, Quilt of Souls is a blueprint for capturing stories of family members of generations, of past generations.
Hmm.
And I would tell every young person to capture the story of your parents and your grandparents. Write them down, ask them what happened to them when as they were growing up, what important information or historical information they can give them to pass on to their generation.
Mhm.
And because somehow, and I would just like to put this out to every young person, it was a time in our lives where oral history was very important, where we would sit around the dinner table and listen to those stories. But somehow over the years, people have minimized the impact of oral history and how it serves, currently, how we need to take those stories and pass them on, because if you don't pass those stories on, the stories will stop and there will be no more stories. And then, because I'm also a genealogist, and I have done over 100 genealogy projects for people who don't know who their grandparents are. They don't know their maternal side or their paternal side. And so it's my job to try to find these people when the only thing they have is their name. And I have done genealogy reports where they have actually went to school with first and second cousins and didn't even know it.
Hmm.
Didn't even know it. So now they're trying to connect, but a lot of the history is lost because they never got the information. And of course, I'm finding the information, but that generation, a large swath of that generation is gone. Because right now, my parents passed in 2020, in 2021, and they were born in the 1920s. That generation is almost gone. It's almost gone. And now you have the baby boomers who are the people who need to start passing on that oral history to
Mhm.
their generation. And I really hope that we can just get that across and that can happen, because even, and I bring in the biblical piece. Genealogy is very important, very important. And I think, sometimes I'm going, and maybe it's serendipity or whatever, but my grandparents who couldn't read a lick, like they would say, I would have to sit in the front yard and read them the Bible. And they would love hearing how so and so begat so and so, and so begat so and so. And here I am trying to skip over some of it, and they would know when I would skip a generation, even with all that. So genealogy and passing on that ancestral history is very, very important. It's historically important because it
Mhm.
dates back, you know, years and years ago. And that's how, I realized that genealogy was important. So maybe it was my grandparents' way of saying, you need to never forget, family genealogy and history. Never forget your ancestors and where they came from. And I took that with me, and I still have that embedded deep, deep, deep inside me, even until today.
Phyllis, you have shared so much with us today. Is there any question I didn't ask you that you wish I had?
Oh my goodness, I've covered so much, and I know I have a I have a very long history. I mean, a very long history, because I've done so much. But I think, without a shadow of a doubt, I think you've covered every every aspect of my life, from going into the military, from being even back further than that, being sent to my grandparents, what happened afterwards, and in the military, and what I did as a civilian, and back into the military, and what I currently think in my future projects. So, Meg, I think you've covered it all.
Okay. Well, you are just a beautiful storyteller. I feel like I have walked your journey with you. And Phyllis, it has just been terrific to talk to you today. Thank you so much for spending the time sharing your stories. And I know our listeners would love to reach out to you. What's the best way for them to do that?
They can either go to my website, www.thequiltofsouls.com, or they can always send me an email at thequiltofsouls@yahoo.com. I would love to hear from your audience, and I answer every email if it takes me to after midnight, and I'm an early bird person. I go to bed at 8 o'clock, but I
Hmm.
will answer every email, every last one, because I love hearing from the audience.
It has been a pleasure, Phyllis. Thank you again for joining us.
Oh, thank you, Meg, for having me, and I'm looking forward to talking to you again.
Well, there you have it. Another story about someone just like you, someone for whom a passion became a project, a way of life, and a connection to something bigger. If you know someone you think has an outstanding story, a story that should be shared on this podcast, please drop me a note to meg@soandsopodcast.com or complete the form on our website. Be sure to subscribe to, review, and rate this podcast on your favorite platform, and visit our website, soandsopodcast.com, for more information about today's and all of our guests. That's SEWANDSO podcast.com. And finally, I want to thank Bernina for making this program possible. I'm Meg Goodman, and I look forward to you joining us next time on So and So.